Catus Maximus here. This time doing a review of the Vevor's new MIG 250 pulse welder. Just turned it on, just showing you how long it takes to boot up here. Appreciate Vevor sending me these products. Press and hold this button for 5 seconds to reset it. Pretty loud fan. Does auto detect the voltage and tell you. And I'll mention this is the first issue. This display is way too inset. Just get up a little bit of an angle and you cannot see the volts and amps. But unfortunately there are some firmware programming issues that just weren't picked up very well in quality control. Voltage icon is missing on the 250. It talks about being able to press and hold and adjust the inductance. And these knobs are jog, but they're also press button rotaries, and they don't do anything. Whether you press and hold, it doesn't matter what mode you're in. It does say MIG pulse. When you're in the pulse welding mode, it is Synergic, which means that it adjusts the voltage and the current together. You can readjust it, such as adjusting the voltage down some. The current does this weird thing where it goes negative. And now what we've done is we've kind of, it still says Synergic, but we've changed the offset. And that's the reason you would want to reset it, is because once you fiddle, it remembers all these settings. So if you fiddle with it to say weld some thin material, you have to press and hold and then release and then allow it. Blinks like this for a few seconds and then it will actually reset itself properly. And there it goes, and now we're back at the normal values. I did do some welds here. Aluminum is difficult to weld without pulse because it transfers heat really well, yet it has a pretty low melting point. So you have to have a fair amount of power to actually melt it, but then it's really easy to blow through the metal. So that's what the pulsing is. You can get a pulse of high power to get good melt, drops down so it can solidify without blowing through, and does that repetitively. And I forgot to reset it myself, and so these were actually, it was pretty good. I did a set of 50 amp welds and a set of 60 amp welds at a way too low voltage, around 14 and a half volts at 50 amps, 14 and a half, because I have this pretty thin, come on camera, pretty thin material here, and I don't want to burn through it. And you can totally use 35 thousandths wire to burn through, or excuse me, not burn through, but to weld pretty thin material. Anyway, there was my first weld, and it actually worked just fine, although my helmet was too dark and I couldn't see that I was going off track here. And then this was an attempt to pulse weld at a very low voltage and a very low wire feed rate, and I was just traveling too fast. I increased the current on this side here. There, now my camera is focused. So this was at 60 amps, but I forgot to increase my voltage, and I could have got a little bit better penetration. I could have even welded something thinner, but then I tried with a higher wire. On MIG welders, when you adjust the current, it also is adjusting the wire feed rate. The Synergic means that it's in the Synergic mode, it's also adjusting the voltage. And here, just a little bit more wire feed rate, and I was able to pulse weld this thin piece of material, and just a bit of discoloration on the back, maybe a little bubbling. This was chrome plated, but otherwise you could totally weld pretty thin sheet metal, especially, you know, with full beads. And this was even in flux core, which is not recommended to pulse with or pulse weld with, but it worked just fine and it helped mitigate the heat. Pulse welding is what it does is it feeds the wire at the normal voltage and then pauses the wire feed for just a fraction of a second and reduces the current, but still maintains an arc, and then feeds the wire again. And that's why it was making that fluttering sound versus the other normal welds, was because it's rapid. It's going from you know, full power weld to a slight wire pause but maintain arc and then feed the wire again. And that's why they don't recommend flux core and pulse welding, because you can get some excess oxidization. But if you do something like this where you, come on camera, where you do a stitch weld where you're doing little circles just to kind of keep the wire in the pool a little bit better, it works just fine. And that's the nice thing about pulse welding, is it helps mitigate heat, and that's what makes this capable of doing aluminum. So anyway, what we have is standard, this plain old straight MIG welding where it's manual current and voltage. Pulse MIG welding, and it's also Synergic. One of the disappointments is it would be nice to do pulse welding and then be able to maybe press one of these buttons to have it to enable or disable the Synergic function, so you could have manual settings but just with pulse, but it just won't allow you to do that. We do have stick welding, and then that changes over just to be for plain current. It kind of does this thing where it, like, if you spin the knob fast, it jumps really quickly, and so you have to do the knob really slowly. It's a little bit annoying. It has a VRD, which is a voltage reduction mode. When you're doing stick welding, the terminal is live. When you're doing MIG welding like this, when you press the button and it's sending out wires when it actually is electrified, and then when you let go of the button, it isn't electrified, and it prevents potential shock hazards. With stick welding, it's always live, so the VRD it reduces the voltage. Normally stick welding is like, I think, around 60 volts. And so to reduce shock hazards, it does have a voltage reduction mode where if it doesn't detect current flowing for a couple seconds, it will reduce it down to like 5 volts, so that you just don't have this 60 volt electrode sitting around. And as soon as you try to strike an arc, it'll automatically jump the voltage back up. So it does have that safety feature, and all these welders have a lift TIG mode. And in the manual mode, does this weird thing where it jumps around, where you can tell it to do iron, stainless steel, flux core, aluminum, and then it has this flashing aluminum mode, which I don't know if it's a double pulse or just a low power. The manual doesn't tell me, and that's one of the issues. The manual is really deficient and doesn't describe how to reset it. That's why I talked about that in the beginning. And it doesn't describe what the heck this flashing AL mode is. The only thing I know is that it appears to be a thin material mode, because if we go into the pulse and then do the flashing aluminum mode, we can see that the voltage drops down. So it appears this to be a thin material. I just don't know if that's double pulse or if it's just a low power single pulse. Other issues include that it only supports 0.8 or 1 millimeter wire, where FlexCore North America 35 thousandths is common, which is actually 0.9 millimeters. So you just have to use the 1 millimeter setting and the 1 millimeter rollers, which is another disappointment. So it does accept 10-pound rolls of wire. The 2-pound rolls have a 3/4 inch hole, and then there's a 2-inch hole in these 10-pound rolls. And really, you're best off getting an adapter that has the, the 3/4 inch to 2-inch, so it sits on this entire area. As it sits, what we have is we have a thin little lip here, and then this thing sits down and stops at a certain point. And it just had the silver spring, and that little silver spring was so weak that the roll would actually push this out and slip off this little 2-inch lip. And so I had to add this extra spring so that the roll wouldn't slip off. So there's some improvements that could be made there, which is unfortunate because it actually has one of the best feed rollers I've seen in a long time on these cheap welders. As we can see, gear teeth there, gear teeth there, all metal, easy to replace the bearing. But most of these cheap welders do not have a driven upper roller, which makes a pretty big difference. It really, what it allows you to do is have less spring tension on this mechanism, so it doesn't crush the wire as badly, because it's both driving with the regular traction roller and simultaneously with the top roller. And that's a neat feature. Something else I was going to mention here is it's using, here's my finger, it's using these large diameter rolls. It actually comes with 2 FlexCore rolls, interestingly enough, one installed in the machine. And then it comes with these 3 extra rolls. If we can try to get my camera to focus here, we have a U, a V, and a K. So it includes a U-shaped groove for aluminum wire, a V-shaped groove for solid core and gas MIG, and then of course an extra FlexCore wheel. Unfortunately, there's several standards for these drive rolls. So we have like the cheaper ones that use a square drive. Sometimes they use a round key drive, kind of like this. And then there's the Hobart and the Miller rolls, which are also special to their welders. And then there are these like big roll ones, and we can see that it's actually a bit larger in diameter than these standard kind of budget welders, and that means that there's less steep of a curve, and it gets a little bit better grip on the wire. Talking about some other stuff here, this is the European style welding connector, and actually, I mean, there's like the Hobart and Miller style, and then almost all these imports use the Euro, and the Euro style really isn't that bad. It's easier to deal with. The little plastic tube that the wire runs through does wear out and periodically needs to be replaced. 1. 2, there's a different grade of plastic. Whether you're running steel wire, the plastic's a bit harder and more wear resistant, but you have to pull it out, and it's pretty easy. You just unthread this little bit here. You have to straighten out the whole whip, and then you can drag out and pull out the liner, and then put in, I was going to say put in a replacement plastic liner for aluminum, which you can do. They'll have like a spring at the end. And although I'm not entirely sure about compatibility, because this is actually this entire liner here is a coiled spring steel type liner, which actually should last a long time. I just don't know how it'll perform when you run aluminum wire through it. But the deal is you can pull out these liners and swap them out, and you are supposed to use a different one when you're running aluminum wire, because aluminum wire is a lot weaker than steel wire, and it really likes to get bunched up. You have to be real careful when you're welding aluminum to try to keep the whip as straight as possible and reduce bend so that the wire doesn't... It's actually weak enough to where it'll actually start crimping and jamming up right at the feeder. And that's why it's recommended to run the 1.2 millimeter aluminum wire, because it's a little stouter, although 1 millimeter really isn't that bad. This has, and that's one of the other issues, is this has a really short whip. It's only a 10-foot whip, or a lot of the welders will come with the 12 or 15-foot whip, so you're going to have less feeding problems just because there's less whip to drive the wire through. And that's one of the areas they really cheap out on. This grounding cable here is the shortest I've ever seen on any welder, even that Duralast. This thing is 1.5 meters, or like 4.5 feet long. It's a halfway decent clamp, but it is the absolute shortest cable I've ever seen. Same goes for the stick welding cable. It is the shortest I've ever seen, and this is the cheapest. This, you can see, it has no grooves to hold the rod, so if you put a rod in there, it's going to swing and wobble back. This is actually so bad to be unusable because the rod will swing around. Here's what at least a halfway decent one will look like. You'll have grooves so you can hold the rod at different angles, and it actually stays at the angle. And we can see this is conductive on both sides. Of all my complaints in this video, I'm going to end up keeping it. I mean, it's the only pulse MIG welder I got, so I'm going to keep it because it does work, and the pulsing does work. If this MIG welding whip is short, it's actually pretty high quality. The Pro Stormer has a pretty cheap MIG gun on it, and so this MIG gun is at least like the one highlighted. It just has, once again, a short hose. I mean, it's good. It's really flexible. There's probably 50 to 100 different 250 amp pulse MIG welders on Amazon, all in that around the $300 price range. And this Vevor, with its, particularly with the programming issues and having these push button jogs that don't do anything, missing voltage icon, confusing manual that doesn't even describe how to reset it, advertises inductance and pre-gas and post-gas adjustments which just don't work on this welder. But this is one of those things where, I mean, I have to be honest about it, and if Vevor's disappointed with my review on it, then that's just how it is, because I'm not going to tell people to buy this and then just run into all these problems. It all adds up to frustrations. So this is a Synergic welder. This is really where the salt in the wound comes from. So on this Vevor, God, I wish this camera would actually focus sometimes. Here we are. So it's only 20% duty, 220 volts. It's only 250 amps for 20% of the time. 112 amps at 100% duty cycle at 220 volts with this Pro Stormer on MIG. I mean, it's a 120 volt welder, and it'll do 100% duty cycle at 108 amps. That is literally 4 amps less than this Vevor will do when it's running on 220 volts. Gives you an idea that this has a much more serious power supply, and this will do its full rated output 140 amps at a 60% duty cycle, where the Vevor will only do 145 amps at a 60% duty cycle. It's kind of crazy that this $150 Pro Stormer is almost as powerful as the Vevor at running on a 110 volt outlet. And the Vevor at 110 volts really gets disappointing. 20% duty cycle at 120 amps or 54 amps at 100% duty cycle. That is literally half the continuous output current at 100% duty cycle at 110 volts than this Pro Stormer. I think Vevor really made a mistake in getting these welders, and at least I'm able to... Anyway, thanks for watching.